They tell you the hive never sleeps, and I believed that once. I believed it the way you believe in the recycled air you breathe or the distant thrum of generators that keeps the darkness at bay. The hive was noise and motion and the crush of bodies moving through arterial corridors, and somewhere in that ceaseless rhythm you found your own heartbeat and learned not to notice either one. I had lived 43 years in Habstack Tertius 7, worked 31 of those years in atmospheric scrubber maintenance on levels 240 through 260, and I had never once experienced true silence. I did not know what silence was. I did not know it could have weight, could have presence, could settle into your chest like a stone dropped into still water. I learned these things on the day the sky fell, and I am still learning them now, in whatever remains of the hours that follow, in whatever remains of me. The morning began as mornings always began, which is to say it did not begin at all because there was no morning in the middle levels of the hive, only the cycling of lumen strips from dim amber to harsh white and back again, a simulation of day that fooled no one, but kept us moving through the motions anyway. I ate my ration paced, standing at the counter, because sitting would have meant acknowledging I had time to sit, and time was not something we were meant to have. My wife Cora was already gone to her shift in the textile manufactorum 6 levels down, and my daughter Vess had left for her scolum duties an hour before, and so I was alone with the familiar sounds of the hab block waking around me, the coughing of neighbors through thin walls, the whine of malfunctioning plumbing, the distant clatter of feet on metal grating. I remember thinking about the scrubber array on level 251, how the third intake valve had been showing degraded flow for weeks, and how I would need to file another requisition form that would disappear into the administratum's bowels never to return, and I remember the precise moment that thought was interrupted, because it was the last normal thought I would ever have. The sound came first. It always comes first, now, in my memories, in my dreams, in the waking hours that have become indistinguishable from dreaming. It was not a sound that belonged in the hive. It was not mechanical, not industrial, not the grinding or hammering or hissing that formed the symphony of our existence. It was a voice. That is the only way I can describe it, though I know how inadequate that description is. A voice screaming from somewhere impossibly far away and impossibly close, a voice that seemed to come from inside my own skull, while simultaneously descending from the upper spires where the nobles lived in their distant luxury. The voice was keening, wailing, a sustained note of such perfect anguish that I dropped my ration tin and pressed my hands to my ears and found that it made no difference at all. The sound was not entering through my ears, it was entering through something else. Some part of me I had not known existed until that moment. I do not know how long I stood there. Time had already begun to behave strangely, stretching and compressing in ways that made the chronometer on my wall meaningless. I remember the lumen strips flickering, though that could have been my vision failing. I remember the taste of copper filling my mouth, though I had not bitten my tongue or lip. I remember the smell of something burning, something that was not quite metal and not quite flesh, but somehow both, drifting through the ventilation system that I had spent 3 decades maintaining. And then came the impact. The entire hab block lurched. I was thrown against the wall, then the floor, then something that might have been the ceiling before gravity reasserted itself and dropped me in a heap near the door. The lights went out, came back as emergency red, went out again. The sound, that terrible keening sound, did not stop. If anything, it grew louder, more layered, as if other voices were joining the first, a choir of screaming that seemed to resonate with the very metal of the walls around me. I crawled to the door, pulled myself up by the handle, stumbled into the corridor, and found it full of my neighbors doing the same, all of us moving with the same dazed, bleeding confusion, all of us pressing our hands to our ears even though we knew it would not help. No one spoke. I realize now that no one could speak, that the sound was filling every space where words might have formed, drowning everything that was not itself. We moved as a herd, following some animal instinct toward the main access shaft, and when we reached it, we found the lift mechanisms had failed, and the emergency ladders were already thick with bodies climbing down, down, away from whatever had happened in the levels above. I joined them. I climbed. I do not know how many levels I descended before my arms gave out, and I had to stop on a landing platform where others had gathered, some sitting with their heads in their hands, some staring at nothing, some already dead from impacts I had not witnessed. It was there, on that platform between levels 238 and 237, that I first saw him. He was not dressed like a hive worker. His robes were grey and unmarked, and his head was shaved in the manner of the administratum's lesser clerks. But there was something wrong about the way he stood, something too still, too calm, in the midst of our collective terror. He was watching the people around him with an expression I could not read, and when his eyes met mine, I felt the sound inside my head shift, just slightly, as if it had noticed me noticing him. The stranger moved through the crowd, without touching anyone, without being touched, as if there was a space around him that no one wanted to enter. He came to stand beside me at the railing, and he looked up toward the levels we had fled, and he said the first words anyone had spoken since the sound began. I heard them clearly despite the wailing that should have drowned them out. Perhaps he was speaking directly into that place where the sound entered. Perhaps I was already losing my mind. He said, "They brought their grief with them. Their dead are still screaming." I asked him what he meant, but he was already moving again, already descending the ladder with that same unnatural stillness, and the crowd seemed to part around him without knowing why. I wanted to follow him. I wanted to grab him and shake him until he explained what was happening, but my body would not obey, and so I stayed on that platform, and I watched the stream of refugees flowing past, and I listened to the sound that would not stop, and I began to understand that I was not going to escape it. The news came in fragments over the next hours, passed from mouth to mouth, when people could force themselves to speak, crackling through surviving Vox units in bursts of static choke transmission. Something had fallen from the sky. Something had penetrated the upper spire, torn through levels 300 through 280, and embedded itself in the structural core of the hive. The word Xenos was whispered with the same terror our ancestors must have reserved for daemons, and perhaps they were right to conflate the two, because whatever had fallen was not behaving like wreckage should behave. It was not burning out. It was not going silent. It was still screaming, and the scream was spreading. I made my way down to level 220, where the emergency shelters had been established in a former storage bay. The space was vast and cold, and filled with thousands of displaced souls sitting on cots, or standing in lines for water rations, or simply lying on the floor staring at the ceiling. Medicae staff moved through the crowd with inadequate supplies, treating wounds that ranged from minor cuts to missing limbs, and the Arbites had established a perimeter at the main entrances, their shock moles crackling with barely contained violence. I found a corner away from the worst of the press, and I sat with my back against the wall, and I waited. The sound was quieter here, muffled by distance and intervening structure, but it was not gone. I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that had nothing to do with the hive's machinery, a frequency that seemed designed specifically to unsettle human flesh. The people around me felt it too. I could see it in their faces, in the way they flinched at nothing, in the way their eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling as if expecting it to open and swallow them whole. Some of them were crying, some of them were praying, mumbling the familiar litanies of the Imperial creed with a desperate fervor that spoke to how little comfort the words provided. "The Emperor protects," they said, over and over, but the Emperor was very far away, and the thing in the upper levels was very close, and protection was not something any of us believed in anymore. I slept, eventually. I do not remember deciding to sleep. My body simply surrendered to exhaustion, and I fell into dreams that were indistinguishable from the waking nightmare. Dreams filled with that keening sound and with shapes I could not quite see, tall and slender and pale, dancing in the flames of their burning vessel, their mouths open in screams that would never end. When I woke, the shelter was different, quieter, but not in a good way. People were not talking anymore. They were sitting in small clusters, staring at each other or at nothing, and there was a quality to the silence that felt wrong, felt heavy, felt like the silence before a storm that I had never experienced, because we had no weather in the hive. A woman nearby was scratching at her ears. Not just scratching but digging, her nails coming away bloody, her expression blank and focused in a way that made my stomach turn. I watched her for too long before I realized what I was seeing, before I understood that she was trying to get the sound out, trying to create a passage through which it might escape. A Medicaid attendant noticed her eventually and restrained her, and she did not struggle, did not scream, just continued making the scratching motion with her hands, even though they were no longer reaching her ears. I looked around the shelter and saw others doing similar things, picking at their skin, pressing their palms against their temples, rocking back and forth in rhythms that matched the pulsing of the sound only I could still hear. The stranger in grey appeared at my side without warning. I had not seen him approach, had not heard his footsteps, and when I turned and found him crouching beside me, I felt my heart lurch with a fear that was sharper than anything the sound had inspired. He looked at me with eyes that were too dark, too deep, and he smiled with a mouth that held no warmth. "You can still hear it clearly," he said. "That means it has chosen you." I asked him what it was. I asked him what had fallen from the sky. I asked him who he was, and why he knew things that no one else seemed to know. He answered none of my questions directly. Instead, he told me a story, speaking in that quiet voice that somehow cut through the sound that had drowned out everything else. He told me about the Xenos who had come to our world, the pale ones who traveled between stars in vessels that were half alive, who fought with weapons that screamed with the souls of their dead warriors. He told me about the war that had been raging in the orbital reaches for weeks, a war the Administratum had kept from us because our fear served no purpose and our knowledge served no one. He told me about the aircraft that had been shot down, one of the Pale Ones' atmospheric fighters, and about what had been aboard it when it fell. "The Pale Ones do not waste their dead," he said. "They capture the moment of death, the final scream of the departing soul, and they bind it into crystal. They wear these crystals into battle. They use the screaming of the dead to drive their enemies mad." The aircraft that fell was carrying hundreds of these crystals, the accumulated grief of centuries, the last cries of warriors who died so long ago that their names have been forgotten by everyone except the stones that hold them. When the vessel breached the hive, the crystals shattered, the screams were released, and they are still looking for something to fill, something to replace the vessels they have lost. I did not believe him. I could not believe him because believing him meant accepting that the sound I was hearing was not just noise but intent, not just frequency but hunger. I told him he was mad. I told him I was going to find my wife and daughter, and we were going to leave the hive, and none of this was going to touch us. He smiled that terrible smile again, and he said, "Listen, listen carefully. Can you hear how the pitch has changed?" I listened. I did not want to, but I could not stop myself. And he was right. The sound had changed. It was lower now, more rhythmic, and beneath the keening wail, I could hear something else, something that might have been words in a language I did not know, might have been names being spoken by mouths that no longer existed. The sound was no longer just screaming. It was searching. The man in grey stood and walked away, and this time I did follow him, pushing through the crowd of blank-faced survivors, ignoring the Arbites who shouted at me to stay in the designated area. He moved fast, faster than his unhurried gait should have allowed, and I had to run to keep him in sight as he passed through corridors that grew increasingly empty, increasingly dark. The emergency lighting was failing, the ventilation was failing, the hive itself was failing, level by level, system by system, and no one was doing anything about it, because everyone who might have known how was either dead or lost in the same paralysis that had gripped the refugees in the shelter. We climbed. I do not know why I followed him upward, toward the source of the sound, rather than away from it. Perhaps I had already surrendered to something I did not understand. Perhaps the sound had been working on me from the first moment, preparing me for what came next. We passed through maintenance tunnels and service shafts, past bodies that had fallen and never gotten up, past walls that were beginning to show cracks that glowed with a faint, ghostly luminescence. The smell grew worse with every level, that burning smell from before, metal and flesh and something sweeter beneath, something that made my mouth water, even as my stomach rebelled. The man in grey stopped at a security bulkhead that should have been sealed but hung open, its locking mechanisms fused by heat from the other side. Beyond it, the corridor was transformed. The walls were covered in something that looked like frost but was not cold, something that shifted and glittered in the emergency lighting, something that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at it. And the sound here was loud, so loud that I could feel my teeth vibrating in their sockets, so loud that I could not hear my own thoughts, only the endless layered screaming of voices that had been dying for longer than my species had existed. The crash site was 3 levels above us, the man said, but the screaming has been spreading downward. The crystals may have shattered, but the souls inside them did not dissipate. They are looking for new vessels. They have been looking since the moment of impact. Some of them have found what they were seeking. He pointed, and I looked, and I saw what was standing in the frost-covered corridor ahead of us. It had been human once. I could see the remnants of its workers' coveralls, the remains of a face that might have belonged to someone I knew, but it was not human anymore. It was standing too still, its body locked in a posture that no living spine could maintain, its mouth open wider than any jaw should open, and from that mouth came a sound that was part of the greater sound, a single voice in the choir of the dead, a scream that had found flesh to wear and would not stop wearing it until the flesh wore out. I turned to run. Of course I turned to run, but the man in grey caught my arm with a grip that was stronger than it should have been, and he held me there, and he made me watch as the thing that had been human took its first lurching step toward us, then its second, then its third. It moved wrong. Every motion was wrong, as if the thing controlling it had no understanding of how human bodies were meant to function, was simply forcing the limbs to move through sheer, overwhelming will. And as it came closer, I could see that it was not alone. Behind it, in the frost-shrouded darkness, other shapes were stirring, other vessels that had been filled, other mouths that were opening to add their voices to the sound. "We need to go higher," the man said. "You need to see where it began. You need to understand what is going to happen to this city." I tried to tell him that I did not want to understand, that I wanted to find my family and flee, and never think about this again. But my voice would not come. The sound had filled my throat, had taken up residence in the spaces where words were supposed to form, and all that emerged when I tried to speak was a thin, reedy echo of the keening that surrounded us. The man in grey nodded as if I had answered a question, and he pulled me forward, past the thing in the corridor, past the others that were gathering behind it, through corridors that grew more transformed with every step. The frost was not frost. I understood that now. It was the crystallized residue of the shattered soul stones, the physical manifestation of centuries of captured grief, spreading through the hive like a stain. It clung to the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and where it touched bare metal, the metal began to change, began to develop patterns that might have been writing in a script no human was meant to read. The air grew thin as we climbed, thin and cold, and filled with particulates that glittered in the dying light. I was breathing in the dead. I was pulling them into my lungs with every inhalation, and I could feel them settling into me, could feel them making space for themselves in the hollows of my body. We reached level 267 before the structural damage became impassable. The corridor ahead was simply gone, torn away by the impact, and through the ragged hole in the hive's skin, I could see something I had never seen before. I could see outside, not the distant glimpse of sky that the upper spire nobles hoarded for themselves, but a direct view into the void between hive sections, where the air was supposed to be recycled and returned, but was now simply escaping, bleeding out into the darkness along with everything else that had been held inside. And I could see the wreckage. The alien vessel had been beautiful once, even shattered, even burning with fires that should have been extinguished by the thin atmosphere, I could see the elegance of its construction, the flowing lines that no human hand could have designed, the way it seemed to have been grown rather than built. It was buried in the structural core of the hive, its nose disappearing into the mass of support columns and load-bearing walls that kept everything above us from collapsing onto everything below. Around it, the frost crystal had formed a cocoon, a shell of captured souls that pulsed with light that was not quite light, that moved in patterns that were not quite patterns. The man in grey stood beside me at the edge of the torn corridor, and he was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was softer now, sadder, as if he was delivering news he had hoped he would not have to deliver. "The vessel will not stop screaming," he said. "The souls inside are too numerous, too old, too angry. They have been captive for longer than your species has had language, and their release has driven them beyond sanity. They will keep spreading until there is nothing left to spread through. They will keep filling vessels until there are no vessels left to fill. This hive is dead. It simply has not stopped moving yet." I asked him why he had brought me here. I asked him with the thin remnant of voice that the sound had left me, forcing the words out through the keening that had become my new mode of existence. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were different now, darker still, and I realized that he had never been human, that whatever wore that grey robe and that shaved head was something else entirely, something that had taken human shape because it needed to communicate, because it had a message to deliver, because even the death of a hive city required a witness, because someone needs to remember, he said. Because even now, even as the screaming spreads and the vessels multiply and the end approaches, someone needs to carry the truth out of this place. The Pale Ones did not do this intentionally. They are grieving the loss of their dead just as you will grieve the loss of yours. But grief does not care about intention. Grief does not care about innocence. Grief only knows that it is hungry, and it will consume everything it touches until there is nothing left to consume. I understood then what he was asking me to do. He was asking me to leave. He was asking me to find a way out of the hive before the screaming filled every space, before every surviving human became a vessel for a soul that had been waiting millennia for release. He was asking me to carry the story of what had happened here to someone who might be able to prevent it from happening again, and I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him that I would not leave without my wife and daughter, that I would search every level of the dying hive until I found them or joined them, but the sound was so loud now, so present, and I could feel how close it was to filling me completely, how close I was to becoming just another mouth in the choir. "Go down," he said. "Go to the transit station on level 180. The trains are still running on automated sequences. Get on one, get out, and do not stop until you cannot hear the screaming anymore." He turned away from me then, turned toward the wreckage and the cocoon of crystal light, and he began to walk, not toward the edge of the torn corridor but beyond it, stepping out into the void as if there was solid ground beneath his feet, moving toward the burning vessel with that same unhurried gait. I watched him until the light consumed him, until he became just another silhouette against the pulsing glow of 10,000 released souls. And then I ran. The descent was a nightmare I will not describe in detail, because the details have become blurred, because the sound was so loud that I could not separate one moment from the next. I remember bodies, I remember walls that moved when I touched them. I remember faces I knew screaming with voices they had not been born with. I remember fighting, though I do not remember who or what I fought, only that my hands were bloody when I reached level 220 and found the shelter transformed into something that was not a shelter anymore. The refugees were standing in rows, their mouths open in unison, their voices blending into a single sustained note that harmonized with the keening from above. They were not dead. That was the worst part. They were not dead, and they were not themselves. And they turned to look at me as I passed through them, and I saw in their eyes the recognition of something that was not human, something that knew I was still empty, still unfilled, still a potential vessel waiting to be claimed. I found the transit station. I found a train waiting on its platform, doors open, interior lights flickering. I climbed aboard and I sealed the doors manually and I activated the departure sequence, and as the train began to move, I pressed my face against the window and watched the hive recede behind me, watched the levels blur past, watched the lights of the city that had been my home for 43 years give way to the darkness of the transit tunnels. The sound followed me. Of course it followed me. It was in me now, had been in me since the first moment, and I could feel it settling deeper with every passing minute. But it was not filling me. That was the strange thing. The thing I did not understand until much later, until I had traveled far enough that the hive was just a distant glow on the horizon and the sound had faded to a whisper rather than a roar. The sound was not filling me because something else was already there. Some part of me that had decided without my knowledge that it would not surrender, that it would hold on to itself, even as everything else was taken away. The train carried me to another hive, a smaller city connected by transit lines that had been built in an age when travel between hives was common. I stepped off the platform into a station that looked almost exactly like the one I had left, filled with people who moved and talked and lived their small lives without any awareness of what was happening less than 100 kilometers away. They looked at me with the suspicion that strangers always inspired, saw the blood on my clothes and the wildness in my eyes, and gave me a wide berth as I stumbled toward the exit. I should have gone to the authorities. I should have found someone in power and told them what was coming, warned them to evacuate, warned them to seal the transit tunnels before the screaming could spread. But I could not make myself speak. The sound had taken that from me. All I could do was walk, and so I walked, through corridors and platforms and hab blocks that felt like echoes of the home I had lost, until I found a corner in a forgotten maintenance bay, and I collapsed, and I waited for the end that did not come. The sound is quieter now. It has been 3 days, I think, though I have lost the ability to track time with any precision. The hive I fled to is still functioning, still unaware of its impending fate. The authorities have sealed the transit lines, citing structural concerns in the wake of what they are calling an industrial accident. They do not know what is coming. They do not want to know, and I am too broken to tell them, too hollowed out by the journey and the sound and the weight of what I witnessed. My wife and daughter are dead. I know this without needing confirmation. They were in the lower levels when the screaming began, closer to the crash site than I was, and even if they survived the initial chaos, they would not have survived what followed. They are part of the choir now, their voices blended with 10,000 others, screaming in a language that no living thing should have to speak. And I am here, in this forgotten bay, writing these words on scavenged paper with a stylus that belonged to someone else, trying to make sense of something that will never make sense, trying to carry out the task that the stranger in grey assigned me. The Pale Ones brought their grief to our world, and their grief was too vast for their shattered vessels to contain. The souls of their ancient dead are spreading through my home, transforming everyone they touch into extensions of their endless mourning. By the time the authorities realize what is happening, it will be too late to stop it. The screaming will have reached every level, filled every throat, converted every vessel, and then it will begin to spread to other hives, other cities, other worlds. I do not know why I was spared. I do not know what quality I possess that allowed me to resist where others fell. Perhaps it was nothing more than chance, the random selection of a universe that does not care about fairness or meaning. Perhaps it was the stranger's influence, whatever he was, preparing me for a role I did not ask to play. Or perhaps the sound simply decided that I was more useful as a witness than as a vessel, that my suffering would serve better as a warning than my voice would serve as part of the choir. I can still hear it, even now, even at this distance. It is a whisper at the back of my mind, a constant presence that I do not think will ever fully fade. The screaming has become part of me, has worked its way into the spaces between my thoughts, and I know that I will carry it with me for whatever remains of my life. Some nights, when the hive grows quiet and the recycled air carries the faint smell of burning that reminds me of home, I can almost make out words in the whisper. Names, perhaps. The names of those who died so long ago that even their ghosts have forgotten who they were. The man in grey told me that grief does not care about intention or innocence. I understand that now. The pale ones who brought their dead to our skies did not mean to destroy my city. The souls released from those shattered crystals did not choose to become a spreading plague of madness, but meaning and choice are luxuries that the universe does not afford, and in their absence there is only the screaming, only the hunger, only the endless search for vessels to fill and voices to claim. I think about Cora sometimes, when the whisper grows loud enough that I cannot ignore it. I think about the last morning I saw her, the way she smiled as she left for her shift, the way she always smiled, as if the grimness of our existence was something to be met with warmth rather than despair. I think about Vess, my daughter, barely 16, and already assigned to her solemn duties, already being shaped into the faithful servant the Imperium required. I think about the lives they would have lived, the grandchildren I might have held, the quiet moments of joy that we carved out of the Hive's relentless demands. And then I think about their mouths opening in screams that do not belong to them, their voices joining the choir, their bodies becoming vessels for grief that predates human existence by millennia. The sound has changed again. I noticed it this morning, or what passes for morning in this place. The whisper has developed a rhythm, a pulse that matches my heartbeat, as if the remnants of the screaming are synchronizing with my body, learning its patterns, preparing for something I do not want to contemplate. The stranger told me to run until I could not hear it anymore, but I do not think there is anywhere in the galaxy far enough to escape what has been planted inside me. The soul crystals shattered, and their contents scattered, and some of those contents found their way into me through breath or contact or simple proximity. I am not a vessel yet, but I am becoming one, slowly, inevitably, with every beat of my heart. I saw something in the lower levels yesterday that confirmed my fears. A woman walking through a crowded corridor, her movements too smooth, her posture too straight, her mouth hanging slightly open in a way that no one else seemed to notice. She was one of them, one of the filled. She had come from my city on a different train, perhaps, or she had walked through the sealed tunnels while the authorities were busy pretending everything was fine. And if one had made it here, others would follow. The screaming was spreading, just as the stranger had warned, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I thought about killing her. The thought rose up from somewhere dark inside me, somewhere that the sound had not quite reached, and it lingered longer than I would like to admit. If I could stop the spreading before it began, if I could quarantine the infection, if I could be decisive where the authorities were paralyzed by denial and protocol, perhaps the second hive could be saved. But I knew even as I thought it, that one death would change nothing. The woman was not the source of the spreading. She was just another symptom, another vessel, another mouth in a choir that now numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Killing her would be like trying to stop a flood by crushing a single drop of water. And so I did nothing. I watched her walk past, and I felt the whisper in my head respond to her presence, growing louder for a moment before subsiding, and I understood that the thing inside me recognized the thing inside her, that they were connected by something deeper than sound or sight or proximity. The souls of the pale ones dead were not separate beings. They were fragments of a single great grief, shattered into pieces when the crystals broke, seeking to reunite themselves in whatever flesh they could find. The woman and I were not enemies. We were not even strangers. We were nodes in a network that was growing larger with every passing hour. And soon that network would encompass everyone in this hive, and then everyone in the next, and then everyone on this world, and then everyone on every world where the pale ones had carried their dead. The Imperium will respond eventually. I know this. The authorities will stop denying what is happening and start fighting it. And the fighting will be brutal and ineffective and far too late to matter. They will burn entire sections of the hive to kill the filled, and they will discover that the screaming does not die with the bodies, that it simply disperses and finds new vessels to wear. They will quarantine the affected areas, and the quarantine will fail, because grief cannot be contained by walls or checkpoints, or even the void of space. The Pale Ones learned this long ago, which is why they built the crystals in the first place, trying to give their dead somewhere to rest, not understanding that rest was no longer possible, that their grief had become something else, something that would not be satisfied until it had consumed everything. I do not know how long I have left. The whisper grows louder every day, more insistent, more present. Sometimes I lose time, find myself standing in places I do not remember walking to, my mouth open in that same slack way the woman's mouth was open. The thing inside me is learning my patterns, and soon it will know them well enough to take over entirely. I will become another vessel, another voice, another node in the network of grief that is spreading through the galaxy. And some part of me, some small preserved fragment that will persist even as everything else is overwritten, will know what I have become and will not be able to stop it. But I am writing this anyway. I am writing this because the stranger in grey told me that someone needs to remember, and because even now, even as the end approaches, I refuse to let the story die without being told. The Pale Ones brought their grief to our world. A vessel fell from the sky, the crystals shattered, and the screaming will never stop, because grief is infinite, because loss cannot be undone, because the dead do not rest, and the living cannot outrun them. If you are reading this, whoever you are, wherever you are, I hope you are far from the screaming. I hope you never learn what it feels like to have something take up residence inside you, something that does not belong, something that has been dying for longer than your species has existed. I hope you never find yourself walking through corridors that have been transformed by crystallized grief, never see the faces of your neighbors twisted into masks of eternal anguish, never feel the cold certainty that everything you love is already lost. But if you do hear it, if the whisper finds you the way it found me, I want you to know that it was not always like this. There was a time before the sky fell, a time when the hive was loud with life instead of death, a time when the sound I heard was just machinery and voices and the ceaseless motion of people trying to survive. There was a time when my wife smiled at me as she left for work, when my daughter rolled her eyes at my jokes about cogitator malfunctions, when the worst thing I had to worry about was a degraded flow valve on level 251. That time is gone now. The screaming has taken it, but I remember it, and as long as I remember, as long as some part of me persists beneath the grief that is consuming me, that time will not be entirely lost. It will exist in these words, in this testament, in this last gesture of defiance against the thing that is turning me into something I do not want to become. The whisper is very loud now. I can feel it pushing against the edges of my mind, testing the barriers I have built, looking for the weakness that will let it in. I do not have much time left, perhaps only hours, perhaps less, but I will keep writing until I cannot write any more, until my hands stop obeying me, until my mouth opens in that slack way and my voice joins the choir. The Pale Ones dead are singing, and soon I will sing with them. But first, I will finish my story. First, I will make sure that someone knows what happened when the sky fell and the screaming began. First, I will be human, one last time, before the grief takes that away too. The Imperium tells us that the Emperor protects. I used to believe that. I used to find comfort in the words, in the rituals, in the certainty that somewhere, far away, there was a being who cared about our survival, who watched over us in our darkest moments. I do not believe that anymore. The Emperor did not protect my city. The Emperor did not save my wife and daughter. The Emperor did not stop the screaming from spreading or give me the strength to resist what is happening inside me. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps protection was always a lie we told ourselves to make the darkness bearable. A story we passed down through generations because the truth was too terrible to face. The truth is that the galaxy does not care about us. The truth is that the Pale One's grief is just one of 1,000 horrors waiting in the void, and we are small and fragile and utterly unprepared for any of them. The truth is that we survive not because we are protected but because we are lucky, and luck runs out eventually. For everyone, for every city, for every world. My luck ran out 3 days ago, when the sky fell and the screaming began. Now I am just waiting for the end, writing these words because I do not know what else to do, trying to hold on to myself for a few more hours, because letting go feels like betraying everyone I have already lost. The sound is getting louder. The whisper is becoming a voice. I can almost understand it now, almost make out the words it has been saying all along, and I know that when I finally understand, I will be gone. The thing inside me will take over. I will become another vessel, another node, another piece of the grief that is consuming everything. But not yet. Not yet. First, the story. First, the truth. First, this one small act of remembering, in a galaxy that forgets everything eventually. The sky fell. The screaming began. And the hive died, one voice at a time. This is what remains.